A twig snaps in the dark. The men of Project Gamma freeze, fingers tense on triggers, and eyes scanning every shadow in the jungle. This is one of the most elite and secretive units in Vietnam, but as they move toward the Viet Cong encampment ahead, they keep their heads down. Someone out there is hunting for them. While tearing through the stronghold, an agent finds a roll of undeveloped film at the bottom of a wooden crate. Images appear in a makeshift darkroom. One frame makes every man in the room cold. There he is, one of their own, smiling mid-conversation with uniformed enemy officers. The unit has been bleeding operators for weeks. Now they know why. It was the late 60s, and the war against communism had reached a new height. As the nation braced itself for another election cycle, the aging voice of former President Dwight D. Eisenhower rang out one final time at the Republican National Convention of '68. He warned the nation, quote, "Today the communists reach ruthlessly for domination over Southeast Asia and are trying to break our will to foil the attempt." In the jungles of South Vietnam, that struggle had already claimed thousands of lives. American soldiers waded through waist-high reeds, mud-slicked trails, and tangled canopies, where every vine could conceal a tripwire, and every bamboo thicket could house a sniper. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the war had begun, yet victory still remained out of reach for the Americans. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese not only knew how to use the terrain to their advantage, but they also had learned how to outmaneuver the U.S. through exploitation of regional politics. From hidden sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, they launched raids, slipping across borders, attacking and then disappearing back into countries the U.S. didn't dare to enter. Washington was fearful that crossing into neutral territory would spark a wider war with China or the Soviet Union. Yet, without eyes and ears beyond Vietnam's borders, the Americans knew they couldn't win the war. There was only one team capable of saving the U.S. war effort amid this grim scenario: the Green Berets. These elite warriors were stealthy and precise, perfectly suited to slip into forbidden territory, carry out high-stakes operations, and vanish without a trace, preserving plausible deniability for the American government. The men selected for these missions were chosen with almost obsessive care. Many were handpicked from elite foreign and domestic units. Others were recruited from within the Army ranks and subjected to an extreme vetting process, both physical and psychological. While what would later become known as the Special Forces Qualification Course was still in development, by 1968, candidates were already undergoing one of the most demanding training programs in the U.S. military at Fort Bragg under the eye of the CIA. To become a special agent, Green Beret candidates must navigate miles of treacherous terrain alone, carrying heavy rucksacks while disoriented and racing against the clock. They undergo rigorous training in survival tactics, combat medicine, sabotage, demolitions, and the operation of foreign weapons systems. In addition to specialized combat instruction, they attend courses in language acquisition, cultural immersion, and high-stress decision-making, preparing not just to survive in some of the world's most extreme battlefields, but to infiltrate enemy strongholds and gather intelligence no other unit can reach. Their final test takes the form of a simulated revolution in a fictional country. It's an immersive, weeks-long guerrilla warfare exercise where they must raise a resistance movement and lead it in an armed uprising against a mock regime. This field training, currently known as Robin Sage, is unlike anything else in the U.S. military. Only those who pass earn the right to wear the Green Beret. When these men were sent out to Vietnam and its neighboring nations, they were some of the finest soldiers America had to offer. In Vietnam, the strategy was to fight fire with fire. Where the enemy thinned on guerrilla tactics and fluid movement, the Green Berets would counter with their own type of unconventional warfare. They operated far from command posts and out of radio range, slipping into enemy territory with little more than their instincts to rely on. In remote jungle paths, they trained and armed local villagers, turning farmers and fishermen into scouts, fighters, and guides. With their help, the Green Berets were able to navigate the terrain as if they'd lived in Vietnam their entire lives. While regular units fumbled to find their ground, these men knew exactly where to find the enemy. And when they did, they struck hard with ambushes, sabotage, or sudden raids designed to destabilize entire enemy sectors. Rumors swirled through the ranks that some teams were so deeply embedded that they knew the Viet Cong by name, being able to get close enough to them to track their every move without being noticed and eliminate them when they least expected it. Among these elite units was Detachment B-57 of the 5th Special Forces Group, better known by its covert name, Project Gamma. Originally operating out of Saigon, the unit was relocated to Nha Trang in early 1968. Their mission was to penetrate enemy strongholds across the Cambodian border, identify hidden bases, and conduct sabotage operations against them. If a target was too large to neutralize alone, Gamma agents radioed back coordinates to initiate B-52 bombing runs, obliterating entire compounds with a single strike. If captured, the soldiers weren't protected by the Geneva Convention. Discovery could mean not only execution by the enemy, but also an international scandal. To maintain secrecy, all members of Project Gamma were required to operate under fake identities, posing as civil affairs or psychological operations officers. Despite these risks, Gamma quickly became one of the most efficient assets for American forces in Vietnam. Historian Shelby Stanton would later write that by 1969, Project Gamma, quote, had developed into the finest and most productive intelligence collection operation the United States had in Southeast Asia. The unit was reportedly responsible for 65% of all actionable intelligence on North Vietnamese base camps in Cambodia and 75% of the intelligence on enemy forces within South Vietnam. However, not everyone was happy about Project Gamma's success. Although technically under Army command, Project Gamma was said to answer only to the CIA. To the regular Army brass, this autonomy became a threat. Some U.S. Army Chief of Staff would accuse the Special Forces agents of being, quote, refugees from responsibility, nonconformists who couldn't quite get along in a straight military system. And no one disliked these agents' growing independence more than General Creighton Abrams, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. A conventional warrior to his core, Abrams distrusted covert operations and resented the CIA's influence over what he saw as rogue elements within his own command. Yet day after day, as Gamma continued racking up victories, he remained powerless to rein them in. All he could do was wait for the moment they made a mistake. The situation would begin to shift for Project Gamma in the early months of 1969. Missions were still being launched, but something was off. One by one, their best agents, men who had previously slipped in and out of Cambodia without being detected, began vanishing without a trace. Teams would wait in the dark for a return signal that never came, and after days of no signs of life, all they had left was the certainty that their assets had either been captured or worse. After several disappearances, officials began to worry this wasn't just bad luck. Someone was tipping off the enemy, and given how quickly and precisely the North Vietnamese were intercepting their movements, it had to be someone on the inside. An internal investigation was launched, with every agent, handler, and courier being put under scrutiny. Some lower-level South Vietnamese operatives were exposed for weapons trafficking, but none accounted for the string of breaches that had gutted the network. Weeks passed without the mole being uncovered. Gamma operatives continued to cross the border into the Cambodian jungle, gathering what they could, never knowing if they were walking beside the very man who had condemned their friends and who could sell them out to the enemy next. During one operation, a pack of special agents slipped across Vietnam's border. Hours later, they reached their target, a hidden Viet Cong encampment. Agents spread across the camp, searching for any valuable intelligence they could bring back to base. Inside a command shack, one of the agents located stacks of enemy documents, accompanied by a roll of undeveloped film buried at the bottom of a wooden crate. As the film was revealed and the pictures came to life, the men could not believe it. Tai Hoc Xuyen, the trusted Gamma agent, in conversation with Viet Cong operatives. Tai Hoc Xuyen had been brought on as a translator, but there was something about him that never quite fit. He spoke fluent English, far too fluent for just a regular Vietnamese asset. He'd collaborated with numerous U.S. military branches in Vietnam, yet he always ended up leaving each post abruptly. Still, he managed to earn enough trust to join Special Forces teams on live ambush missions. In February 1969, Xuyen and Terry McIntosh, a Green Beret from the 5th Special Forces Group, were deployed on a nighttime ambush patrol with 10 local troops, tracking Viet Cong movements near the town of Mac Hoa. Hidden in the dark, McIntosh, using a night scope, spotted silhouettes creeping through the jungle and prepared to strike. At the moment of contact, McIntosh launched a round from his N-79 grenade launcher. The jungle lit up with the blast, followed by a barrage of gunfire released by his men into the tree line. He recalls that upon passing the scope to Xuyen to confirm the enemy's retreat, he saw him smiling, McIntosh reached for the radio to call in motor support, but the airwaves were dead. With no time to troubleshoot, he rallied the team and plunged into the trees, chasing the retreating enemy on foot, weapons blazing. Everyone returned fire, except Schwinn. When bullets cracked through the trees, McIntosh caught a glimpse of him off to the side, fumbling with his weapon. When questioned, Schwinn claimed his weapon had jammed. Moments later, the Viet Cong counterattacked from deep within the tree line. Outgunned and unable to call for backup, McIntosh had no choice but to order a retreat. The next morning, the technician discovered that McIntosh's radio had been sabotaged. The frequency had been switched, cutting any possibility of calling for contact amid the fight or being located by the officials back at base. At the time, there hadn't been enough evidence to pin the incident on Schwinn. Still, with the recovered film showing him alongside the Viet Cong, there was no longer any doubt about him being the one responsible for the incident. Reflecting on the betrayal and why Schwinn didn't just turn the gun on him during the shooting, McIntosh later wrote, quote, "He was using us at the time and not trying to eliminate one American soldier." Everyone agreed that Schwinn had to go. However, no one knew exactly how to get rid of him. After weeks of surveillance and debate, the men of Project Gamma, many of whom had seen their operations sabotaged and comrades lost due to the lethal leaks Tai Kok Schwinn had made, decided to detain the Vietnamese agent and conduct a grueling interrogation. Schwinn was thrown into solitary confinement. Over 10 days, he was pressed, probed, and ultimately injected with sodium pentothal, a so-called truth serum believed to be capable of lowering inhibitions and forcing out answers. Agents sought to know just how deep his collaboration with the North Vietnamese went, and exactly how much danger the American agents had been exposed to. During the questioning, troublesome details began to come to light. Schwinn had never been subjected to a polygraph during his recruitment, a critical safeguard that was routinely set in place to catch double agents before they slipped into America's intelligence operations. Why this step was skipped during Schwinn's recruitment process is not entirely clear, and whether it was a simple administrative blunder or the doing of someone helping Schwinn infiltrate the American ranks remains a mystery. However, this wasn't the worst of it. Interrogators began to suspect that Schwinn was also feeding information to the South Vietnamese government. He was, by all accounts, a triple agent. The Americans attempted to understand whether his quest to leak sensitive information was driven by ideology, greed, or coercion. But in the end, it didn't matter why Schwinn had done what he did. He had infiltrated the most sensitive intelligence unit in Southeast Asia. He simply knew too much, and letting him go, whether to a South Vietnamese prison or an American facility, risked everything. He had too many allies who could easily help him escape and continue to carry out operations that would put American agents' lives at risk. The men of Project Gamma reached out to the CIA, soliciting instructions as to how to proceed. Some claim the agency's response was vague, telling the special agents that it was their call as to how to proceed with Schwinn, yet they advised against taking him out. However, some others assert that the CIA's answer was far more grim, telling the agents to, quote, terminate with extreme prejudice. On the night of June 20th, 1969, the interrogation cell holding Tai Kok Schwinn was visited by a team of Green Berets from Project Gamma. The men stepped into the dark room and walked up to Schwinn, but they hadn't come to ask any more questions. Schwinn, pale and hollow-eyed after days of relentless questioning, could barely stand up against the men as they pinned him down, making it impossible to resist as one of the men administered a dose of morphine. He was immediately sedated, unable to resist, as the special agents dragged him out of the holding cell. Outside, the humid air of Nha Trang hung thick over the coastline as the team loaded him into a vehicle and headed toward the bay. There, a boat was already waiting for him. Using the night as their cover, the men shoved Schwinn aboard. The boat sliced through the black water, moving just far enough from shore, yet reportedly still fairly close to the headquarters where the rest of the 5th Special Forces Group were resting. Some accounts claim the men asked Schwinn a series of final questions. Others say no words were spoken. Either way, the men ended the Vietnamese agent's life with 2 muffled gunshots. When asked about Schwinn's whereabouts, the men stuck to a well-rehearsed script. The agent had been dispatched on a highly classified mission across the border. No further details could be given. After days passed and no word from him, they would claim he had vanished behind enemy lines, lost to the jungle, and with no possibility of retrieving his body. Most accepted the story without question, but one man did not. Sergeant Alvin Smith, Schwinn's former handler. He had been the one who failed to polygraph Schwinn during recruitment. He had vouched for him. And now, the men who had executed the traitor might see him as a loose end. Haunted by paranoia and afraid for his life, Smith slipped away from the base and ran to the CIA office in Viet Cong. There, in a desperate confession, he told everything: who had been involved in Schwinn's execution, how it had been carried out, and why, allegedly even accusing the Green Berets of being dangerous, crazy men. The CIA could not afford to look the other way, and with no other option, they notified the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. By the time the report landed on General Creighton Abrams' desk, every sordid detail of the extrajudiciary execution was laid bare. For a commander who had long distrusted the rogue autonomy of the Special Forces, this was the ammunition he'd been waiting for. Before General Creighton Abrams could bring the hammer down, he needed to ensure the trap was perfectly set. He picked up the phone and dialed the office of Colonel Robert Rio, the newly appointed commander of the 5th Special Forces Group. Rio had only held the position for a matter of weeks when Schwinn vanished. Abrams didn't waste time with pleasantries. He demanded to know where Tai Hak Schwinn was. Rio, sticking to the pre-approved story, calmly explained that Schwinn had been dispatched on a highly classified mission and had not been heard from since. That was all Abrams needed. Within hours, formal charges were prepared against the 8 men tied to Schwinn's execution. Though the colonel had not pulled the trigger, Abrams believed he had signed off on the execution, or at the very least, conspired to cover it up. The accused Green Berets tried to defend themselves by insisting they were acting under CIA guidance. But almost immediately, a memo surfaced. Allegedly sent from CIA headquarters, it warned Project Gamma not to harm Schwinn under any circumstances. Whether this message had been genuinely delivered, conveniently overlooked, or fabricated after the fact to shield the agency from scandal, its implication was clear. The CIA had washed its hands of them. With no institutional backing and no official defense, the 8 men were arrested and marched to Long Binh Jail, an austere military prison near Saigon, infamous among U.S. forces. The fallout was immediate. Headlines across the world painted a damning picture of America's special forces. In Moscow, Soviet broadcasts seized on the news, branding America's elite warriors as lawless thugs who murdered the helpless under the guise of war. Back in Washington, officials scrambled as they attempted to contain the civil war that had just erupted between 2 of the most critical arms of the U.S. war machine, the Army and the CIA. Some within the military attempted to shut down the case. There was, after all, no corpse, no physical evidence tying anyone to the crime. But Abrams wouldn't relent. Obsessed with bringing the Special Forces to heel, he even ordered the Navy to send divers into Viet Cong Bay. He wanted Schwinn's body raised from the seabed, so he could shove it in front of the world as irrefutable proof that Project Gamma had gone rogue. Shortly after launching his offensive against Project Gamma, General Creighton Abrams found himself in the middle of the storm. Though some in the upper ranks of the military supported his crackdown on the Special Forces unit, the American public didn't side with him. The Green Beret affair, as the press soon dubbed it, was increasingly viewed as a politically motivated revenge, and to many, the Green Berets weren't criminals. They were patriots under siege. By November 14, 1969, Colonel Robert Rio was featured on the cover of Life magazine. Inside the feature, referring to the dispatching of Viet Cong forces, his 11-year-old son said, quote, "What's all the fuss about? I thought that's what Dad was in Vietnam for." As supporters rallied, fellow Special Forces officer Charles M. Simpson, who would later chronicle the Green Berets' history, flew to Saigon to aid Rio and the other accused as the trial loomed. But Abrams wasn't about to let anyone undermine his authority. The moment he learned of Simpson's arrival, he erupted at the staff, stating, quote, "Tell that SOB to get the hell out of the country ASAP." He then threatened to put Simpson in his cell next to Rio. The courtroom showdown began before the end of 1969. But despite Abrams' drive to pin the crime on the Green Berets, there was still no conclusive evidence he could use against them. Almost as soon as hearings began, the case began to crumble. Rumors began circulating that many of the Green Berets involved weren't even formal U.S. Army personnel. They were allegedly CIA assets under unofficial status, stripping the military of its authority to prosecute them. The Army's Judge Advocate General, Captain John Stevens Berry, subpoenaed CIA officials to testify, but the agency refused to allow any of his personnel to take the stand and be questioned about state secrets. With no clear path to a fair and public proceeding, Secretary of the Army Stanley Reeser ultimately had to announce that the charges against the Project Gamma men were dismissed. The men were free, and as Rio walked out of the shadow of his prison cell, he accused the Army of going against, quote, dedicated soldiers for doing their job, carrying out their mission, and protecting the lives of the men entrusted to them in a wartime situation. But the damage was already done. Despite its unrivaled success in the field, Project Gamma was quietly shut down the following year. The name was erased from official records, and to this day, public records detailing the exact operations Project Gamma carried out across the Vietnam border are not available. Colonel Rio, once believed to have been destined for a general star, ended up having to cut his military career short and retire. As for the role of commander of the 5th Special Forces Group he left behind, Abrams tried to replace Rio with one of his own men, Colonel Alexander Lemburies, a conventional officer with no Special Forces credentials. However, the agents wouldn't have it. When Lemburies first tried to put on the Green Beret, Command Sergeant Major of the 5th SFGA stared him down and told him to take it off immediately. Lemburies wouldn't last much longer in the position. The Green Beret affair struck another blow to an already crumbling faith in the Vietnam War, with the spectacle of decorated Special Forces soldiers being charged with murder only deepening the feeling that America had lost track of the conflict. It was in this climate of eroded trust that military analyst Daniel Ellisberg went against the government. Convinced that the American people had been deliberately misled, he leaked a trove of classified documents known as the Pentagon Papers. The documents revealed the many secrets of the war, including that the conflict had less to do with defending South Vietnam and more with containing Chinese influence, propping up military juntas, and executing covert operations years before the first American combat troops officially arrived in the country. The public outcry was immediate. With domestic pressure mounting and the streets filled with protests, the U.S. government was forced to accelerate its path to peace. In 1973, the signing of the Paris Peace Accords marked the beginning of the American withdrawal from Vietnam. In the end, not even the precision of the Green Berets or the intelligence triumphs of Project Gamma could shift the course of the war, as no victory could be claimed for battles fought in the shadows.